Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the show. You're lucky I'm here. I got caught in 4 motorcades in Melbourne for ASEAN. It's a gridlock out there. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. More bad news for housing in Australia. New data showing there's no way we can keep pace with our record immigration. Add in anemic growth numbers out today. And the reality is that we're in a per capita recession. And that's precisely why you are hurting. And while ordinary Australians are doing it tough, the Albanese government Minister Tony Burke, well, he's living it up on the taxpayer, spending an extraordinary $58,000 for just 4 days in the US. But the bloke's got form. He loves the front end of a plane and fancy hotels if you are paying. More on that coming up. Also, the Victorian government defies the Parliament to keep a report into injecting rooms secret. And a day after the Queensland Premier is accused of lying in the Parliament, his government moves to take the word women out of abortion laws so as not to offend trans men. And we'll get to all the Super Tuesday news out of the US, all the analysis from Greg Sheridan. It's all one-way traffic, though, for the Republicans. Nikki Haley, no chance as Donald Trump sets his sights on a rematch with Joe Biden.
We have no choice because November 5th is right around the corner. November 5th is going to go down as the single most important day in the history of our country.
But first, along with all the other issues, Australia's high immigration is making worse. There's also the housing crisis. Net overseas migration that ran at an all-time record of over 500,000 last year is putting upward pressure on house prices, downward pressure on wages and massive pressure on our infrastructure. Then there's a question about the readiness of some recent migrants to join Team Australia as opposed to just living in Hotel Australia. But there's a further immigration-related issue too, apart from just the cost of housing, and that's whether we even have enough housing to put a decent roof over everyone's head with current high levels of immigration and our low levels now of home construction. Research out from the Institute of Public Affairs suggests that natural population increases will create the need for around 70,000 dwellings per annum, while expected immigration rates will require the creation of almost 120,000 extra dwellings per year. Yet the latest figures show we'll be lucky to build 150,000 new dwellings, consistently short of the nearly 200,000 we need every single year. Now, the IPA says that very high immigration is, quote, setting us up for a humanitarian disaster, with a net housing shortfall of more than 250,000 dwellings likely over the next 6 years. The latest dwelling approval, says the IPA, shows we are simply not building enough homes for first-home buyers and new migrants alike, despite record intakes. Now, while approvals for apartments increased by 14% over the calendar year, approvals for detached houses, well, they fell by 10%, leading to an overall decline in dwelling approvals for the 1-year period, despite the push from the government, of course, but that's all because of record population growth. Hence, we've got soaring house prices and high rentals, plus an extreme shortage of places to rent. Rents are going up around 10% per annum, so a lot more than wages are increasing. And as we reported last night, the national vacancy rate for rentals is now less than 1%. Again, this is because the federal government is pressing the accelerator on immigration, while state and local governments are pressing the brakes on dwelling approvals. Or they're taxing property and land so hard that developers and landlords are selling up. In March 2021, for instance, there were 14,000 dwelling approvals. Yet since then, the numbers have fallen consistently, down to just 7,000 for January this year. Now, the ABS says we've got 29.5% of our population born overseas. That's a big jump. That's almost 30% of our population. Compare that with the US. UK and US, they're at 15 and 14% respectively. So it's no wonder that Australians want immigration scaled back, at least until our housing and infrastructure can catch up. Last December, polling for the IPA showed that 60% of Australians, they want immigration paused. Yet the Albanese government's still expecting at least 1.5 million new arrivals over the next 5 years. And the government's Help to Buy scheme, even if it works, which is doubtful, will help just 40,000 people into a home. Now that's a mere rounding error on what's needed. Just like the government's energy policy, Labor's housing and immigration policies are creating yet another slow-motion train wreck. And they're doing it all just to pump prime GDP. Those numbers out today that show, on the face of it, Australia avoiding a recession. But the problem is, in per capita terms, so per head of population, we are already in a recession, and that recession just got deeper today. Now look, a lot of Australians, not my Sky viewers, but a lot of Australians probably haven't heard of the Canadian opposition leader Pierre Poilievre. He's a smart, no-nonsense conservative who's really taken up the fight to left-wing hero and general flake Justin Trudeau. Poilievre also doesn't mind showing up ignorant journalists along the way.
You're obviously taking the populist pathway.
What does that mean?
Well, appealing to people's more emotional levels, I would guess. I mean, certainly you tap very strong ideological language quite frequently.
Like what?
Left wing, this and that, right wing. I mean, it's that type of ideological thing.
I never really talk about left or right.
Anyways, I don't
really believe in that.
Okay. A lot of people would say that you're simply taking a page out of the Donald Trump book.
Like which people would say that?
Well, I'm sure a great many Canadians, but...
Like who?
I don't know who, but...
Well, you're the one who asked the question, so
yeah.
You must know somebody.
Okay. I'm sure there's some out there, but anyways, the point of this question is, I mean, why should Canadians trust you with their vote, given... not just the sort of ideological inclination in terms of taking the page out of Donald Trump's book, but
what are you
also
talking about? What page? What page? Can you give me a page? Give me the page. You keep saying that. In terms
of turning things quite dramatically, in terms of Trudeau and the left wing and all of this. I mean, you make quite a it's quite a play that you make on it. So I'm
not
just
sure.
wondering.
I don't know what your question is.
I tell you, that is a masterclass of how MPs should deal with some in the media. But with his consistently good polls, he won't just be the opposition leader. Poilievre is likely to be the next Canadian Prime Minister within the next 18 months. And on his Twitter feed this week, I watched him very closely. He was talking about one of his candidates, Jamil Javani, and I noticed this. He says, this is Poilievre, he'll help me axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget and stop the crime. The left used to jeer at Tony Abbott's mantra, but that helped cut through and helped him win a landslide. Let's hope the same is happening too in Canada. I'll kindly report too, Tony Abbott has met Pierre. They got along like a house on fire. Maybe a bit of help's happening there across the water. I don't know, but we'll find out, won't I? All right, let's head to camera now for the headline. Sky News political reporter, Olivia Casely.
Good evening. The economy has grown a little, but not a lot, lifting 0.2% in the December quarter and 1.5% across the calendar year.
Even weak growth is welcome growth in the circumstances.
Government spending and private business investment propping up the economy as households cut back on non-essential activities like dining out and buying new clothes.
We are seeing a confidence recession. Australians are losing confidence, and this is showing up in the figures. They're cutting back on any discretionary spending they can.
The Treasurer describing Labor's tweaks to the Stage 3 tax cuts as the centrepiece of cost of living relief.
We're not currently contemplating any further changes in income taxes.
But keeping the door open for more sweeteners in the May budget.
If we can do a little bit more in another area or two, then obviously we'll see if we can afford to do that.
The opposition seizing the figures to attack Labor's handling of the economy.
I don't think Mr Albanese has a clue when it comes to the economy or what he's doing.
Labor ministers have lashed Paul Keating after his stinging critique of Foreign Minister Penny Wong's handling of China.
Yeah, he's entitled to his views. I don't lose sleep over it, but I would say this: it was a new position to be lectured about the country of whether or not I understood the country of my birth in Malaysia.
I think Paul is wrong about Penny, and I think he's wrong about Mike.
The Greens have fired their first election salvo, promising to build 360,000 affordable homes over 5 years.
The public property developer will save a renter, on average, participating in the scheme, $5,200 a year on their rent, and a first home buyer $260,000 on the price of a home.
Grandstanding, gridlock and policy grenades are not going to house anyone.
Housing's shaping up to be a key issue ahead of the next federal election. The Greens have been holding out support for Labor's shared equity scheme unless the government commits to further tweaks to tax concessions such as negative gearing. Meanwhile, the coalition has recommitted to its 2022 election pledge to allow first home buyers to dip into their super to purchase their first property.
All right, lots around. Let's get into the headlines. The Daily Telly's National Affairs Editor, of course, Sky News host James Morrow, and one of our senior reporters from Sydney, Credlin Marcus. Great to have you both. This story in the Telegraph today, James, I find it extraordinary. Employment Minister Tony Burke under fire after revelations, and thank you, Telly, for the FOI getting this information out, revealing that taxpayers forked out $57,000 to send him and a staffer to the States for a meet and greet with our ambassador, so not a big kill there, and a US senator. That is extraordinary over 4 days, but he has form. I mentioned this at the top of the show. He and a staffer, she was a staffer at the time, she's now his wife, Sky Larris. Well, they spent $48,000 for a first-class European trip courtesy of the taxpayer. Now, this trip that you're talking about today, James, happened in 2022, but as I said, we only know it because of your FOI. I mean, this is a shocking look for a government that says it understands cost of living worries.
Well, and you know, the whole thing, Peter, you dive into the details and you really see how extraordinary this trip, not just this trip in 2022 to Washington was, but his whole history. You know, back in 2015, the Daily Telegraph, and I even made notes, that's how much stuff there is on this because I couldn't even put it all just at the top of my head, because in 7 years to 2015, he was the $4.6 million man for all of his expenses. He has a huge amount of form on this. This trip to Washington, this trip, $8,000 were spent on hire cars. One day a hire car waited for him for 13 hours. He sent stuff to the hotel laundry and got it dry cleaned and charged the taxpayer. I mean, anybody who stays in hotels knows what an absolute ripoff that is, Peter. And, you know, we're in this time right now where household incomes are going backwards. Our GDP per person, as you said, is going backwards. There are people who will be making choices about, you know, can we fly to the Gold Coast this year, or do we take a caravan holiday? People who say we can't take a caravan holiday, we can't do anything, you know, and he's flying and slugging business class tickets to go have a few meetings in Washington on a jolly, and it just seems absolutely extraordinary that Labor, the ones who lecture all of us about, you know, all those people doing it tough. You know, they are the nomenclatura of the old Soviet times. I mean, this is how it is. It's one rule for them, and we pay for it, and then everybody else is doing it tough. Well, hey, that's the price of, you know, a good Labor government, Peter.
I tell you, I used to tell ministers, and this probably may be unpopular, that you are never to charge the taxpayer for a hotel that you wouldn't pay for yourself out of your own pocket. So pick a hotel brand or a level of a cost per night of something you would do and pay for with your own family, and that's it. Don't go out on taxpayer largesse, as it looks like Tony Burke's done. Caroline, another day, another revelation about one of these foreign criminals. This one's extraordinary. A 37-year-old bloke arrested and charged for breaching his visa and bail conditions, not once but twice. He fronts to Melbourne Magistrates Court yesterday. It's reported today, of course. He blamed short memory and losing phones, etc., for not doing the right thing. But he gets bail again.
He does, and I'll tell you how that happens, Peter. It happens because in this case, the prosecution did not even oppose bail for this bloke. And that's because they said that even if he was to get a jail sentence for breaching his visa and bail conditions, it's unlikely that that jail sentence would be longer than the time he would spend on remand if he was refused bail, which tells you everything you need to know about the sentencing, how sentencing works in this country. I mean, this is a bloke who not just once or twice forgot to ring the Border Force reporting line that he had to as part of his bail conditions, but repeatedly failed to check in with them over a 6-week period. And he told them it's because he forgot. He had a short memory. His phone was broken. He lost his phone. I mean, if he had a dog, he would have said his dog ate the phone. I'm sure of it. Look, he's among 26 people who were released as part of that court decision back in November to release detainees that have now been rearrested for various offences. There's a pattern here, Peter.
Spot on. The pattern is the government's not doing anything about it as well. Let's go to South Australia. We know there they voted against the Voice. James, they voted against the Voice with a higher percentage out of South Australia than the national average. Doesn't matter. The Premier there is pushing on with a state version of the Voice anyway. But what I find very disturbing, there's a debate now erupting about the eligibility of some of the Indigenous candidates to stand for the South Australian Voice. And so we're having this whole debate about who really is Aboriginal or Aboriginal enough. So it's a race-based assessment. This is not going to bring Australians together.
Well, and isn't it interesting, Peter? This is exactly what you and I and a lot of other people talked about during the debate for the National Voice, for the Canberra Voice, that there would be a whole fight over who was eligible to sit on this thing. Now, I guess on one level, we can be glad that this is confined to South Australia and let it be a warning to other states and jurisdictions that are out toying with this sort of thing themselves. I know Victoria is, I think on some level, New South Wales is. So all of that said, I just don't think has any place in a country like Australia where the whole idea is that we don't identify, as anything other than Australian for the purposes of whether or not you're allowed to vote or sit on a representative body to the government.
What about this one, Caroline? Look, last week I talked about an NHS declaration out of the United Kingdom that breast milk and trans women's milk, so chest milk produced by hormones, was exactly the same. I don't think any woman who's fed a baby thinks it's necessarily exactly the same. Nope. But also this insanity, related insanity in Queensland, you've got the Premier looking like he's lied to Parliament, forced to apologise yesterday. But at the same time, he is looking to amend abortion laws in that state, take out the word woman and put it in replace it with person so that trans men are not embarrassed or offended when it comes to procuring an abortion. I mean, you're kidding me.
Maybe the Premier needs to focus more on telling the truth in Parliament and not laughing when he's asked very serious questions about youth crime instead of this ridiculous radical gender ideology stuff. Because now they're looking at replacing the word woman with person in what is called the Termination of Pregnancy Act. And it's all about making it more inclusive, which seems to have become a code word for excluding biological women from their own health care lately, Peter. Instead of worrying so much about whether we're going to potentially offend a very tiny, minuscule proportion of people that suffer from gender dysphoria, I think the pro-life groups would probably argue here maybe there needs to be more focus on protecting the rights of unborn babies in some of the features of the legislation as it is when it comes to late-term abortions and reviving babies who survive these kinds of procedures. But I think the most shocking thing here for me was that This is already in place in many states and territories, including here in New South Wales, which I didn't realise, as well as South Australia, Western Australia and the ACT. They've already adopted this radical gender insanity. I'm just surprised it's not in places like the progressive capital of the country in Victorian, your own state, Peter. But it's only a matter of time.
It'll come here. It'll come here. It'll come here. It's wrong. It's wrong. Women are being wiped out across the board, and you're right to make those other points about abortion laws more generally. Thank you both for your time, James and Caroline. All right, let's get our wrap on the US Super Tuesday, of course, winding down. For the latest, let's bring in the foreign editor for The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Well, 15 contests, Greg. Basically, it's Trump, though, and daylight in the wash-up. Where does Nikki Haley go from here, and what happens now to the Trump juggernaut?
Well, Peter, great to be with you as always. This was a huge day for Trump. All the momentum is now with Trump. Having said that, I like Nikki Haley. I like the fact that she doesn't do as she's told. Trump tells her to get out and she won't, and she won Vermont. Good on her. She's a heroine of democracy. But Trump has all but won the nomination. This should worry Biden very badly, especially because Trump in his victory speech was rational, calm and almost presidential. He was gracious and he went to his strongest suit, which is his policy differences with Biden. Now, rational Trump frightens the Democrats far more than deranged Trump does. If rational Trump is the guy we get for the next 6 months, he'll win. Of course, the record is not great for Trump maintaining discipline for months at a time, but all the momentum is with Trump. If in Biden's primaries, the uncommitted vote was often as big as Haley's vote in the Republican primaries. So that's Democrats going to a primary and preferring an empty chair to Biden. And then Biden's utterly marginal challengers often won 10% of the vote. So I think this is a very worrying day for Biden. Long, long way to go before the election. But all the big mo is with Trump right now.
Polls are saying that a couple of recent polls even have got Trump ahead of Biden. But even in the polls where Biden a little bit earlier was ahead of Trump, growing concern about his medical and mental capacity, I guess, to run at it for another 4-year term. Are they going to move on him, do you think? I mean, as Trump gets stronger, and I take your point absolutely, a sober, considered Trump is very effective. Is there going to be a sense of disquiet in the Democratic movement to say, look, you know, we've got to be cruel to be kind here. We've got to take him out and put someone else in?
Peter, to be honest with you, I don't think they can take him out, but they might convince him he has to stand down. You know, Biden's a formidable old codger in his way. I mean, he has the Democratic Party under his thumb in the way Trump has the Republican Party. I mean, I wouldn't choose either of them, but Biden is nonetheless potentially in quite a bit of trouble because Trump has, as they say, a very high floor and a very low ceiling of voters. Trump is never going to win 60% of the vote like Ronald Reagan did. He'll win 46% of the vote. He might win 47%. He might even win 48%. And that could win him the presidency, especially if there are third-party candidates. Biden's big danger, though, is that everything that you say is absolutely true, and that is translating into an absolute lack of enthusiasm for Biden. Now, a low turnout must favour Trump. Trump, with his high floor and low ceiling, he benefits from a low turnout. It's hard to see that Biden can generate enthusiasm to get a big turnout the way he did last time by terrifying everyone about Trump. He's so low energy now, I don't think he can even campaign in the way he did last time. Now, Biden is nonetheless a rational actor. If he thinks he's going to lose for sure, he could well switch at the convention to whoever the Democrats think is the best candidate, whether that's Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or some other state governor. So he could stand down. I don't think they can blast him out. These two old guys, I tell you what, if you just want it on age difference, you know, they are grey power. There's no doubt about that. They've got their respective parties under their thumbs.
Well, another 80-year-old who's making headlines this week, Paul Keating, he came out swinging saying Anthony Albanese should have fired the ASIO boss Mike Burgess when he took office. And he also had a crack at Penny Wong. What's happening inside Labor here? Because we had all that spy noise last week. We know most of the chatter that you and I heard centred around Labor MPs, not exclusively, but predominantly Labor MPs. And then you've got Keating weighing in, and, you know, what gets under his skin is anything about China. Read it for us, Greg.
Well, Peter, Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO, was very carefully non-partisan, and the only guy who's gone to jail over foreign interference was trying to interfere in the politics of the Liberal Party. And we know there are Liberals who've gone on the Chinese, influence circuit, as well as Labor people. So Keating's attack, I don't think, had any basis in partisanship on the behalf of the intelligence agencies. One good thing happened today, which is Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, who is Keating's best friend in the federal cabinet and the conduit of his influence, said Keating was wrong to attack not only Penny Wong. Everyone in the Labor Party will defend Penny Wong, and she should be defended. She's an honourable, good person, and Keating's attacks on her are ridiculous. But Chalmers also defended Mike Burgess, and he said very clearly and explicitly, Keating is absolutely wrong to attack Burgess, and I think Burgess is a first-class person, and I stand by him 100%. Now, Albanese should have said that, but it's good that Chalmers said it. Keating is, I think, a kind of pathetic old guy these days, and everything he said was contradicted by Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, by President Marcos, the President of the Philippines, and even the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar. A couple of years ago, he was saying ASEAN had to gather together to defend against China, and then he went on to say he would welcome Australia as a member of ASEAN, and Australia doesn't want to join ASEAN. So Keating's idea that we've discredited ourselves by being pro-American is utterly ridiculous. But I'm surprised that Albanese didn't come back and respond properly to Keating himself. They keep trying. Albanese is avoiding the press now. He's had all these pickbacks, but a very marked lack of press conferences out of this. I used to cover ASEAN conferences for a living, and this has got to be the smallest number of press conferences I've ever seen at an ASEAN conference. He didn't respond to Keating, just like he didn't respond to the Chinese attack on our sailors at a previous international summit. And I don't think you win a foreign policy debate by curling into a fetal position and hoping nobody attacks you. And if he smacked Keating around a little bit, everybody would love him. He'd look like a strong, determined Prime Minister, instead of which he allows these bizarre and ridiculous and utterly ill-informed Keating attacks to just roll on. And, it's just that people feel a bit chivalrous about Penny Wong is the only reason that anybody in Labor responds to Keating.
Not wrong, Greg, and I think it's becoming a tactic of the Prime Minister. We saw it with him. I didn't answer my phone, or I didn't get a phone call, or I wasn't briefed. Those points you make about the lack of, exposure and transparency in these ASEAN press conferences and questions from the floor. I mean, I think it's a real deliberate tactic of his office now to pull him out of the media and hope that they get away with just pretty pictures. I don't think that's sustainable. Parliament will be back, not next week, but the week after. We'll see what happens then. Thank you, as always. All right, after the break, let's get into GDP. Forget the headline number. Everyone says that it's good. It's not. It's actually very, very anemic, but it is positive territory. It's the per capita recession figure that I'm interested in, because we are in a recession and we're 3 quarters in. It's getting worse. Plus, it's been over a year now since the Victorian government was handed a report on that proposed second injecting room for the Melbourne CBD. Well, today they defied a parliamentary order to produce it. So what happens next? What have they got to hide? Welcome back. Still to come, yet more industry experts calling out Chris Bowen's car tax. This is shaping up to be another botched policy from Labor that'll cost you more and do diddly squat for the environment. But first, we all know cost of living is hitting Australian families and anyone on a fixed income. But GDP figures released today reveal just how much households have cut back in the last quarter. Overall GDP growth has slumped from 2.1% to 1.5%, not unexpected given the tightening of interest rates, but What's telling is that household consumption grew by just 0.1%, declining in per capita terms. Joining me now for his analysis on this and more, business commentator at the Herald Sun, Terry McCrann. Well, first up, Terry, as far as I can make it out in per capita terms, this is Australia's third quarter of negative growth, so it confirms that in terms of per head of population, we're in recession, we're still in recession, it's getting worse if you look at this quarter's set of numbers, and that's why we all feel worse off.
Peter, these figures describe an economy that is sick, very sick. And the more you dig into the detail, as you describe it, the worse it looks. Let's start with those headline numbers. Every quarter, the growth rate has stepped down. So we finished the year with a growth rate of just 0.2%, which is effectively standing still. And over the whole of 2023, we had a growth rate, again, as you noted, of 1.5%. That, apart from the COVID years, that is the lowest full-year growth rate we've seen, wait for it, since 2000. 23 years ago, we had a growth rate this low. Even at the bottom of the GFC, we didn't have an annual growth rate this low. That's the overall number. And we're only getting to that overall number because of two things. That massive population growth, again, as you emphasised, Peter, restate these numbers on per head terms, and that's what matters to individual Australians. Big numbers don't matter. It's what's actually happening to them individually, personally. Individually, we've gone backwards. We are clearly in a per capita recession, and there isn't any obvious exit. There's no sort of gateway we can walk through come the middle of 2024.
What does my head in, Terry, is the number of people in the media who reported all of this today is somehow great, fantastic, positive news. You know, they see a plus in the front of some of this economic data. That's all they see. That's all they can understand. They talked about electricity and groceries, the consumption there rising by 0.7%. Well, fair enough. Electricity, you have to pay for it. Groceries, you have to feed your family. But anything that was discretionary, that was down, even though this last quarter was the Christmas period. So you're right, that tells you how crook things are. And I reckon the government will look at all of this and they'll run into the May budget and they'll start throwing more money at perceived problems. And of course, that fuels inflation.
Well, exactly, Peter. As I say, there is no exit, and the sort of exit that Jim Chalmers might seize upon is just going to make the situation worse. The obvious reality is what matters to individual Australians. None of this tells us about the cost of living crisis. We've got an economy which is battling, and equally we've got this continued cost of living pressure, which reflects itself in exactly those numbers, Peter, that you're desperately maintaining spending. You have to maintain spending on the necessities, and discretionary spending goes by the wayside. And that feeds back into a negative loop, into the businesses that impacts, the negativity that flows across the economy, and that flows back again to employment prospects and wage prospects. And then bring in the level of interest rates and the pressure on household budgets from those home loan repayments. So none of this can in any way be described as positive. It's all negative.
And of course, at the same time as businesses are doing it tough, you've got the ACTU. This is big news today, running out on a push to enable union delegates to get onto your work site to recruit people for the union. Now, until now, they've only been allowed on a site to represent members. If they didn't have members on that building site or business site or, workplace, they couldn't go on there. We know there's less than 9% of Australians in the private sector workforce who even belong to a union, so they effectively shut out of a lot of workplaces, and I think a lot of workers like that as well. Now they want to be able to walk in straight in your front door, whether you like it or not, whether your workers want them there or not. And I guess my concern, this could be a return of the sort of standover tactics that some of these militant unions are famous for.
Peter, it's all part of a matrix of policy moves that we're getting from the federal government, which is trying to recreate the reality of union power from the 1970s, the sort of union power that a sensible Labor government in the Hawke-Keating government realised had to be modified. You had to get industrial relations reform back in the 1980s in order to get productivity, in order to get the jobs growth, the real jobs growth that we need and what the workers need. I mean, this is a desperate sort of ploy by both unions and this government to try to force people back into the straitjackets of being part of unions and part of that negotiating process. And, you know, big business might be able to cope with it. It will be devastating, though, the further it goes, for small and medium-sized businesses, and again, ultimately, for the job prospects, for the wage prospects of ordinary workers. This is not a process which is going to lead to jobs and wage increases.
Well, thank God you've got a long history in IR, and thank God, Terry, you could read these numbers, unlike most of your colleagues in the journalistic endeavour. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Let's go to something I touched on last night, and this really, really worries me. Not just the crime wave across our country, but the age of some of these offenders. Last night I reported that case of a 14-year-old autistic girl in Melbourne, attacked in broad daylight, filmed, I might add, and circulated to humiliate her. Well, since last night, 3 14-year-old girls and 1 18-year-old woman have been arrested for this alleged attack. Then there was that case of a 13-year-old boy arrested and charged by police with the sexual assault and stalking of a female jogger. And this comes at a time when state governments across the country, and there's a debate also involving the federal government, about raising the age of criminal responsibility. Even the Vic Police union boss, Wayne Gatt, says he's got serious reservations about this. Have a listen.
From 10 to 12, yes, there's crimes committed, and that is clear. But when you go from 12 and upwards, those crimes increase in their frequency and they increase significantly in their severity. Now, that has to be a consideration, particularly when we're seeing what we're seeing at the moment.
Joining me now, the Shadow Police Minister in Victoria, Brad Batten. Well, Brad, welcome to the program. I mean, Wayne Gatt, right? He's the union boss. He's concerned. I think he's right to be concerned, isn't he?
Yeah, I've actually spoken to Wayne about this, Peter, on many occasions. We've regularly caught up and spoken about one of the things we both agree on. We would actually love to have a world where no kids were in jail. That would be an ultimate outcome for not just us, but for the community. But the reality is it's the wrong time to be talking about raising the age right now. We've got a massive issue with youth crime in Victoria, where the numbers are out of control. But it's not just the crimes, it's the violence of the crimes. And what you said at the start of your segment here is actually those filming of the crimes. And the one where the young girls are beaten up on a pier, I sat with my wife when I got that video before it went out to media and have a look at that. And it brought my wife to tears. So these are the crimes that are impacting the entire community. And if we raise the age, these kids have got the opportunity to get away with it. And we just can't stand by and let that happen. We need to be out there and making sure the kids understand there's consequences for their actions. And that means this is the wrong time to raise the age. Now is the right time to start talking about how we can put the right penalties in place and get some of these kids off the street or the services they need to stop committing crimes in our community.
Or throw the book at some parents, Brad. I mean, you've previously worn a police uniform. I mean, what shocked me when I heard those statistics and stories in the last couple of days, and we get a bit immune to it in the media. We're talking constantly about crime in Victoria and Queensland in particular. A 13-year-old kid, right? A 13-year-old charged with the sexual assault, allegedly, of a woman, a female jogger. I mean, that shocks me.
That shocks everyone, Peter, when we hear about some of these offences. That's what I said, it's the violence level in these crimes. And you said sexual assault at such a young age. Generally, you have to say a lot of these are learned behaviours. And yes, then we have to investigate and look at what's happening in the homes of these kids are or causing these kids to commit those crimes. And we can put things in place to try and work with those families to prevent that happening in the future. But the reality is there's a fall in the system or failing in the system. When these kids are arrested and we see them continuously get bailed, then there's absolutely nothing that's happening to intervene with the families to work with those kids to prevent them committing crimes. And when they commit these violent crimes and get bailed, what do? They go back out and commit the crimes again because there's no penalty. And I always said it's a silly analysis, but if you get home and your dog's torn up something in the house and then you challenge the dog for what it's done wrong 6 hours later, it won't understand what you're talking about. It's the same with children. If you don't take them through the court system for 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, they know they're getting away with it and they'll continue to commit those crimes. So we need to speed up the court process, get support services for these kids and intervene in the families where we need to.
All right, we know this proposed second injecting room report has been with the Victorian government for over 12 months. There was an order of the Victorian Parliament for the Premier to produce and release publicly this report. She declined to do that, refused to do that, breached the requirement today. I want to know, what are they hiding? Why can't this report be in the public domain? But I think worse than that, what's the consequence of a Premier who defies her own Parliament?
So the challenge here for us with the Premier defying the own Parliament is it's, even though the order is for the Premier, it's actually for the Minister in the upper house. So the consequences can be a Minister can be suspended, and we've seen it in the past where Gavin Jennings got suspended for a 6-month period. But I think the thing for the community is, what are they hiding? Why don't they want the community to see this report? We've seen too much hidden from this government, and it's not just in the injecting rooms. It's not just the outcomes of what can happen in these injecting rooms. It's crime. It's not just crime. It's actually some of the reports we've seen from the government that they don't release in relation to IBAC. We've got the Richmond report that they're still hiding. We have to go into FOIs to get anything from the Department of Justice. This government has more time and more money and more lawyers to stop information getting out than they have police on the streets protecting our community, programs for young people that need it. And we need to change what's happening in government. That includes the people who do use these drug facilities or are addicted to drugs. We need to get them the support services they need. But the reality is this report has failed to get it out, and the community deserve to know, and the Premier should be held responsible for not letting Victorians know.
I'll keep pushing. Brad Batten, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Right after the break, Bowen's kidding himself. Well, that's the assessment from one big car importer over what amounts to a new tax on vehicles. That's all about those emission standards, plus more bad news for private health insurance premiums. It's now also the private hospitals who are buckling under pressure. Welcome back to Still the Calm. Kel Richards, as always. It's Wednesday. But first, let's bring in my panel, Shadow Environment Minister, Senator Jonathan Duniam, and columnist with The Spectator, Terry Barnes. Well, gents, thank you for your time. American Ram, those great big utes or pickup trucks. I went to school in America. That's what they really are. Very popular in Australia now, but the company that's importing them, Attico Automotive, is warning that costs will increase by $15,000 plus if Labor's new emission standards go forward. The bloke who runs it, Roger Zagorski, says, Chris Bowen, you are kidding yourself with these new standards, which says to me, Senator Duniam, they've got to back down on this. We had those reports too in the middle of ASEAN that the Thai Prime Minister was raising concerns about these emission standards because it'll impact exports from Thailand into Australia, of course. But the Albanese office says, no, the issue wasn't even raised. So what's going on here?
Yeah, look, I'd be embarrassed too if I were the Prime Minister and his office. The Thai Prime Minister is on the money here. Thailand, major manufacturer, as you say, Peter, importing about 260,000 cars a year into this country. A lot of them Fords, Mitsubishis, Mazdas, many of them going to be impacted by this new car tax. So what the Thai Prime Minister said confirms everything we've been talking about, which is cars will be more expensive, which means people won't be able to buy them. And this is everything Labor have been denying. So, of course, the PMO are doing their level best to go, no. Nothing happened. There's nothing to see here. It's all good. And we understand people are doing it tough, yet they proceed with this ridiculous tax. It's time for them to fess up, admit to what was discussed in the meeting, and also admit to Australians that cars are going to be more expensive and it's not going to help in this cost of living crisis.
Terry, you're a health boffin of some renown, so timely that you're here to talk about private health insurance. We had that increase, obviously, yesterday, announced by the government. But we find out today in The Australian that out-of-pocket medical expenses, they've gone up by almost 40% over the last 3 years. There's concerns, too, that a whole lot of the private hospitals are, basically against the wall. We've heard that there's 16 facilities that have announced closures or at least having their private status revoked since last year. What's going on here?
Well, Peter, I think there are three definite things in life: death, taxes and private health insurance premium increases. But look, and I don't begrudge the government from running a ruler over
the increases, but I do wonder about the timing of the announcement after the Dunkley by-election. Oh, please. But when you think about it, I mean, private health insurance pays for services. It pays for hospitals. It pays for doctors and surgeons. It pays for prostheses and medical devices. It pays for other services like optical and dental. And all of these things, all of these services and bits and pieces actually rise in cost at a greater rate than general inflation. So premiums have to follow that. And certainly I think the health funds do everything they can to keep them as low as possible, and governments on both sides of politics actually do their best to run the ruler in a tough way. But when it comes to private hospitals, they are doing it tough. I mean, some of those businesses are struggling a bit, and certainly some of those hospitals are struggling or closing. But you've got to bear in mind that the legislation that was put in place by I think it was the Keating government back in 1995, and I worked on that at the time, actually protects private hospitals from health funds driving too hard a bargain in negotiating contracts. And if they are making commercial decisions about the services they offer or where they place these hospitals and day procedure centres, you can't blame the private health insurers for that. So I think it's a two-way street. Insurers depend on the hospitals to provide the services their member wants, but the hospitals depend on the insurers. So that relationship never works well. They never seem to realise that they are in this together, and that's part of the problem here.
John, I want to talk about offshore wind. We read today that there's a whole lot of foreign companies, yet more foreign companies, about to get the go-ahead for a big project expansion in Victoria. 90% of these turbines are made in China, so the jobs are in China, the profits are in China. There's money going overseas to these foreign companies when they get their licences in Australia to operate here, and I'm sure plenty of subsidies go their way. But there's nothing in these contracts about what happens to these turbines when they get to the end of their life in 15 years. I mean, do we just leave them to rust in the sea? I am so worried about offshore wind projects.
And you're not alone, Peter. Every fisherman and woman I speak to has similar concerns as well. This big green push, the push for renewables to be at our front and back doors by tomorrow by this government, isn't accompanied by any sense of reality when it comes to the real environmental impact of these wind turbines. And the whole of life, if you look at it from construction to decommissioning, how you dispose of every element of the wind turbine, it's not accounted for in any sense, including when it comes to carbon emissions. On your program, we've seen the evidence previously of what they do with terrestrial wind turbines at end of life. They just sit them out in a paddock somewhere. That is not good environmental management. So I say to those proponents, then if you're serious about environmental improvement and getting better gains for the planet and the world we live on, then actually come up with a real plan to deal with these issues. Be honest with Australians and people across the globe about what environmental impact we really have from wind turbines. But I have fears, like you just outlined, these things are left to rust because no one can see them. It's not our problem, but it will be one day, and we need to actually own up to that.
Gents, I'm out of time. Thank you very much. Catch up with you both next week. All right, after the break, Kel Richards, lots of words to get to tonight, some good ones too. See you then. Welcome back. Joining me, as he does every Wednesday, my good friend, wordsmith, broadcaster, Kel Richards. This is a good one, Kel, because we both love language. There was a report out this week saying kids as young as 3, constantly scrolling on phones and devices means they're not learning words, and that's a real worry. It's getting worse, not better. There's a word now, though, to describe this phenomenon.
Yes, there is. It was coined by an Adelaide academic, Mary Brush, and she coined the word technoference. So it's a combination of technology and interference, so a portmanteau word. And technology is interfering with little kids. She discovered that with average 3-year-olds in Australia are having 3 hours of screen time every day with smartphones and smart devices and TV, which they plonk down in, or the phones are given to them as a babysitting device. But the result, she says, is those little kids are missing out on hearing about 1,000 adult words in that time and missing out on about 200 conversations in that time. And that's how they learn. That's how they get the gift of language. So words matter. Words communicate and connect, and we are raising unless parents start changing how they function, we are raising a generation who won't have that connection and communication that words give us.
Yeah, and look, the kids don't buy the device themselves. You know, the kids get the device handed to them from mum and dad. And
That's right.
I sit at restaurants a lot of the time and I see the whole table, mum, dad and the kids all on devices. They're not learning table manners. They're not learning conversation. They're not picking up words. We'll leave it there. That's enough of the lecture from me.
Oh,
hey,
yes,
the word eavesdropping. We talked about spies last week. One of our viewers, Mark, wants to know, where does the word eavesdropping come from?
It's an Old Norse word originally, so it came from the Vikings, from the Anglo-Saxon period. And there was a part of the house called the eavesdrop because they worked out to have projecting roofs over the side of the house before they invented gutters. So it was the eavesdrop where the water ran off on top of anyone who was underneath. But that space between where the water dropped and the wall was the space where spies would gather, because if you got underneath the eaves and put your ear against the wall, you could spy on what the people were doing inside. So the eavesdrop area became the place where the eavesdropper was doing the eavesdropping.
Fat lady. It ain't over till the fat lady sings. Where's that one come from?
Two possible sources, either from opera, you know, one of those endless Wagnerian operas which doesn't end until the fat soprano sings her final aria, or from church, where church doesn't end until the choir, with the fat lady in the front row, sings the final hymn. So from either of those sources, Southern America, 1976.
And it's all fat women, isn't it? It's terrible. We probably can't say that anymore, but we're all getting fatter, so we probably can. Kel Richards, thanks as always. See you next week. All right, that's it from me. Tomorrow night, back here at 6 though. Up next, Andrew Bolt.